whether or not Gina Carano is ever going to be back with Star Wars again, that's all speculative. Here's something that isn't speculation. There is nothing speculative about this at all. The Star Wars fandom is one that a lot of people like to frequently say is toxic. They like to frequently complain about racism and sexism and homophobia. Basically all of the isms and all the phobias. They like to attribute all of this stuff to the Star Wars fan base. And ironically, a lot of the people who demanded that Gina Carano be fired basically over an opinion that they didn't like are actually amongst the most toxic of them. Easily, hands down. These are people who a few years back, when the first trailer for The Force Awakens was released, they rushed onto Twitter and onto social media and they started complaining about about Star Wars fans apparently being angry that there was a black guy in the movie. Now, that is a very bizarre thing to accuse Star Wars fans of. Because for decades, Lando Calrissian has been one of the most popular characters in Star Wars. Mace Windu, played by Samuel L. Jackson in the prequel trilogy, he's also a very popular character. So for them to suddenly come out and start saying that, Star Wars fans were mad that there was a black guy in this movie, that made sense to absolutely nobody, except for the people who wanted to hear that. And meanwhile, Star Wars fans were actually sitting there, they were watching this whole thing happening, and they were just saying, like, what? Nobody's actually saying anything about this. Nobody's actually complaining about this. But there were all kinds of media stories that broke talking about how, Star Wars fans are upset that there's a black guy. Star Wars fans are upset that there's a Latino guy in Star Wars. That was nothing that Star Wars fans were actually saying. And the Gina Carano firing is the most recent indication that perhaps that is the case. It does appear that there have been challenges to that hegemony, and the people who were manipulating and concocting this narrative were bound and determined that it was going to be them. And over the coming years, we frequently saw signs that it in fact was them. Basically, it was a forced factioning of the Star Wars fandom. And one part of this fandom, one faction was going to have the ears of the Star Wars creators, and one was not. That's what Jon Favreau represented to these people from the very beginning, which was why a lot of them came out screaming that they didn't even want Jon Favreau to be able to create a Star Wars series. And actually specifically because they didn't want another Star Wars property developed by a white male, which actually turned out to be rather ironic because all of these people jumped behind Rian Johnson's Last Jedi, specifically because Johnson was endorsed by the quote-unquote right people, and Jon Favreau was not. And so really a lot of them did take it very personally when it was The Mandalorian that proved to be the most successful of the franchise. And so a lot of these people took it personally when it turned out to be Jon Favreau's vision for Star Wars that was the more successful of the two. For them, it wasn't supposed to be this way. It wasn't supposed to be the guy who was perceived of the fans that they had falsely accused of being racist and sexist and, of being all the isms and all of the phobias. It wasn't supposed to be that vision of Star Wars that was supposed to chart the future. It was supposed to be theirs. Because one thing that is actually, very stunningly common amongst this particular segment of the fans is that really they don't actually care very much where Star Wars goes if fans are satisfied with it. They only care who's in control of it. This particular faction of the fans very much embodies what I refer to as the toxicity of status obsession. If you want to see a film that demonstrates this pretty effectively, you actually need to look no further than Wreck-It Ralph. The basic premise of that film is that, Ralph is the villain of their video game in the arcade. And the other characters, they do need him. But because he's the villain, he's perceived as being low status. And so they treat him badly, and they insist upon treating him badly. And when he asks for better treatment than what he's been getting, they basically tell him, it's like, no, this is how you're going to be treated because you're low status, because you're the bad guy, because you're the villain. When he leaves their video to go off and be a hero in another video game, They discover pretty quickly exactly how badly they needed him. And in the case of Wreck-It Ralph, it turns out that they actually literally needed him to survive. And really, they had to have recognized that all along. But they were so obsessed with having somebody lower status than them that they could look down on, that it didn't really matter. At least not until it literally endangered their lives. And I think that this one particular faction of Star Wars fans are exactly the same way. They realize that they have demonized another faction of Star Wars fans, one that is in fact bigger than they are. But you have to remember what the predominant portion of the Star Wars fandom is. They are nerds. Now, when I say that, I don't actually mean that in a derogatory sense. I grew up a nerd, so I know the nerd culture pretty well. And one thing that I discovered about the nerd culture is that, when you're a nerd in high school, you are growing up, and you're at the bottom of the social barrel. You have the least status of anybody around you. Now, nobody wants to be the lowest status person amongst their body of peers. And so one thing that I noticed about what I would call nerd culture growing up is that there was like this mad scramble for status amongst the people that I would have described as nerds. There was a very palpable obsession with making sure that there was always somebody a little bit further down the social ladder from you. And there were people that I observed amongst that particular social segment that were willing to do some very underhanded things in order to make sure that they didn't feel like they were the bottom of the social barrel. And as I observe this whole Gina Carano situation, I see a lot of those same dynamics at play right now. Basically, what you're seeing at work is a lot of people who didn't want Gina Carano fired because it was the right thing to do, but they wanted Gina Carano fired because that would show that they're powerful. That they are powerful, and that they are somebody to be reckoned with, and that they are somebody who's going to get their way. Now, for Gina Carano's part, she's landed on her feet. She turned around the very next day. She did a deal with Ben Shapiro and Daily Wire to write, produce, and star in her own film, one entirely of her own creation, one that she had said that had been her dream for years. In doing so, she's moved her career into a place where this woke mob is never going to be able to touch her again. She talked about making herself uncancelable, about refusing to be canceled. And that's exactly what she's done now. So not only has she already found herself her next gig, something that these people were determined that she should never be able to do. Not only has she found her next gig, but she's moved right into the executive office. She's not going to be a player in somebody else's production anymore. She's come back and now she's a boss. She's everything that a lot of these women go out there and they talk about, everything that they talk about wanting to be. These people just made Gina Carano, they just made her that. So if making Gina Carano even more powerful than she was before, if that was the goal of this woke mafia, all I gotta say is, slow clap, boys. Congratulations, you did it. Good job. And while I have seen a few of them come out and say it's like, oh, well, whatever she does at Daily Wire, it's not going to be as big as Star Wars. Maybe not. I don't think that anybody is under the delusion that it's going to be. But whatever it's going to be something that she owns. Something that belongs to her entirely. If these people can't see the value between, working for somebody else who might happen to be much bigger, or working for yourself and owning it yourself, then quite frankly, you and I are just not built the same.